I use strobes for 80 or 90% of my portraits. So I wanted to find out if I could use a drone with a flash. And if you're watching this video, you probably want to find out too. I've been excited to test out drones for portrait photography. The drone cameras usually have small sensors and low megapixel counts, but the camera's on a gimbal and they can fly. Now it's not obvious how to trigger a flash with a drone, but there is a way and I've been experimenting with it. We're using a drone indoors, so I've got prop guards installed as a safety precaution, and I've got the controller set to cine mode. That keeps the drone's movements slow and under control. Keep pets away and make sure your subject is aware of the drone's position at all times. Now here's a fun fact. My house is in American Class G airspace, but the FAA doesn't control the airspace within your house or studio. I'm Part 107 certified, but you don't need to be in this situation. If you're outdoors and you're furthering a business, then you do need to be certified. The default for drone photography is not to use a flash. If we stick to indoor natural light, then we're forced to raise the ISO if we want to have faster shutter speeds. We can start at lower shutter speeds with ISO 100 and maintain that exposure by doubling our ISO while halving our shutter speed. Now this is a tiny sensor, so we see a lot of noise at most ISOs, but I'd probably draw the line at 400 or 800 max. As we get into those higher ISOs, especially 1600, 3200, 6400, we get huge amounts of noise, and I think that renders the picture unusable. Next up is video light. Lots of photographers like using these for stills because you see the effect of the light before you press the shutter button. The reason I tend to avoid them for still images is because they consume a lot of power and have a relatively low power output compared to strobes. They're a constant glare in your subject's eyes and they generate a huge amount of heat. In fairness, some of my hero photographers like Arnold Newman used continuous lights for their portraits, so I can't really argue against them. With a continuous light on full power and increasing the ISO to get faster shutter speeds, we can do a good job at freezing motion. That all depends on what we want as a final result. Maybe we don't intend on having a lot of movement, so we can use slower shutter speeds. Maybe we've got movement and we don't mind the motion blur. Natural light and LEDs are definitely suitable for that sort of shot. But if we want to freeze motion, strobes or flash are usually the best tools for the job, and I need to find out if they're still the best tools for the job when I'm using a drone. With regular cameras, you can trigger a flash or a strobe with a remote, or you can set it to be an optical slave triggered by a flash from the camera. With a drone, we don't have either of these options. So what can we do? Well, there's one more way to fire your flash, and it's a way that you might not have considered to use for an actual photograph. On most remotes, there's a test fire button, and we can use this to our advantage when using flash with drones. It won't sync to your drone's camera shutter, and you'd be pretty special if you can press the button at the instant an image is taken when you've got a fast shutter speed. So let's increase our odds with having a longer time with the shutter open. That'll give us a little window where we can fire the flash manually, and you'd be right thinking a longer shutter speed will increase the exposure time and make for a blurry photograph. If we were only using available light, then that's exactly right, but we're going to reduce the amount of available light reaching the sensor and rely on the flash to give us a sharp image. You can't change the aperture on a drone like this DJI Mini 3 Pro. It's a fixed f1.7, but we can use an ND filter to reduce the ambient by a few stops and use a low ISO to kill a few more. You already know that I use ISO 400 unless there's an exceptional situation, and this is an exceptional situation. I'm testing shutter speeds of 1 second, a half second, or a quarter second to see how much ambient I can cut out, but give me enough time to trigger that strobe manually. The remote needs to be accessible near the drone controller. I don't want to be fumbling when I'm operating the drone. Let's see what the delay is when we press the shutter button on the controller. If I trigger the flash at the same time that I press the shutter button, I get a dark frame. We've pressed it far too early. If I press the shutter and hesitate slightly and then press the flash remote, now we've got the rhythm we need for each shot. We are dragging the shutter, meaning that the shutter's open for a while there's a pop of flash at some point while it's open. But we don't know if the pop was at the beginning or the end of the exposure, or something in between, and it's probably different for every shot. When I started experimenting, Two problems immediately come to mind. The first is that the screen will always show you the ambient lighting. It's not like an optical viewfinder that shows you what the world looks like without the camera's exposure settings. With an ND filter on and very little lighting in the room, you get a dark image on the remote and it's very hard to see what you're aiming at. And this also has implications for autofocus. With the ND filter on, there's less illumination and contrast for the sensor to focus on. So we have to leave in enough ambient light for the autofocus to work, or else you can use a manual focus setting that you've predetermined for the drone's height. This might not be a problem for drones that have variable aperture, because they could focus at the widest aperture and then stop down to reduce the ambient for the real exposure. But that's not the case on these fixed aperture drones. Another problem is, after you've taken a picture, you don't instantly get an image preview on the screen like you would with a regular camera. You have to occasionally stop and go into the gallery to make sure that your flash is firing correctly. You need a lot of faith that the picture's turned out. You're taking pictures without immediately knowing if it's working or not. And it's a lot of work flying the drone, talking to the subject, operating the flash, and then occasionally going into the image gallery to make sure that everything's working out as you're expecting. It's not trivial trying to get a flash to work with these drones. And I know that they were not designed for it. It's something that I'm forcing upon the system. And I'm not sure that the end result is exactly what I was after. But I want to get a sharp portrait, and I'm trying to figure out ways to do that with these cameras that can take pictures from the sky. You can get sharp shots with higher shutter speeds, but that's usually at the expense of using higher ISOs. And you could lower those ISOs by using a more powerful LED or going out in bright sunlight. But for these dimmer indoor situations, those high ISOs were not desirable at all. With the flash, we either had ghosting when the shutter was open too long, or if I went down to a quarter of a second, the images were better, but the hit rate went way down. I'll continue to experiment using flash with drones, and I'll make an update video with any improvements and answering any questions you might have written in the comments below.